There was a man who taught children. He corrected their homework, spoke softly in the hallways, and smiled at parents during school meetings. He was unremarkable in the way that most people are unremarkable, forgettable even. Colleagues described him as quiet. Neighbors remembered him as polite. And for more than a decade, while he walked through Soviet cities carrying a briefcase, boarding trains, and making small talk with strangers, something was happening that the world could not see and would not understand until it was far too late. His name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, and the question that haunts every person who has ever studied his case is not simply what he did. The question is how. How does a man live inside ordinary life, inside a classroom, inside a family, inside a Soviet apartment building, while carrying a psychological world so fractured, so consuming, so completely invisible to everyone around him, that it would eventually become one of the most disturbing case studies in the history of criminal psychology? The answer does not begin with violence. It never does. It begins with a child, a frightened, humiliated, deeply wounded child, and a silence that lasted decades. If this kind of dark psychological storytelling is what you are looking for, you are in the right place. This is Black Pattern. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and if this documentary reaches something inside you, press the like button. It helps more people find this kind of content. Now, let us begin. To understand Andrei Chikatilo, you have to understand the world he was born into. Not because the world made him do what he did. That kind of simplification dishonors every person he harmed. But because the environment he entered shaped the emotional architecture of his inner life in ways that would take decades to fully reveal themselves. He was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yablushne, in the Sumy region of Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. The timing alone is significant. He entered the world during one of the most catastrophic periods in Soviet history. The Holodomor, the man-made famine engineered by Stalin's collectivization policies, had already torn through Ukraine with devastating force between 1932 and 1933. Millions had died, entire villages had been hollowed out. Families had watched their children starve, and in some documented cases, the hunger reached a level of desperation that resulted in acts no human mind should have to process. Chikatilo claimed years later that his older brother Stepan had been kidnapped and cannibalized by desperate neighbors during the famine. This claim has never been definitively verified by independent historical sources, and some researchers have questioned whether Stepan existed at all, or whether the story was partially constructed or distorted by Chikatilo's own psychology over time. But investigators and biographers who have studied his case have often pointed to this claim as psychologically significant, regardless of its literal truth. Because Chikatilo believed it, he carried it. He spoke of it in interrogation as though it had left a permanent stain on his understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to one another. He grew up in poverty. Real poverty, not the romantic kind described in literature, but the grinding, humiliating kind that teaches a child that the world is indifferent to his suffering. His father, Roman Chikatilo, was eventually taken away to fight in the Second World War, and later spent time in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. Upon returning, he was treated with suspicion by Soviet authorities, as many POWs were, because survival in enemy captivity was sometimes interpreted as collaboration. The shame of this followed the family. His mother, Anna, was described by those who knew the family as a harsh, demanding, and emotionally cold woman. She raised Andrei with an iron rigidity shaped by fear. Fear of what the neighbors would think, fear of Soviet judgment, fear of poverty, fear of the wrong word reaching the wrong ear. In a country where a single accusation could destroy a family, emotional openness was not a luxury most people could afford. It was a risk. And so warmth, in the Chikatilo household, appears to have been something that simply did not exist in any reliable or consistent form. What this does to a child is not immediately visible. It does not announce itself. But researchers in developmental psychology have long understood that children who grow up without consistent emotional attunement, without a caregiver who reliably mirrors their feelings, validates their inner experience, and provides a safe space for emotional expression, often develop what can be described as profound difficulties with shame, identity, and the regulation of their own emotional states. They learn, very early, that the internal world is something to be hidden, something dangerous, something that invites punishment or humiliation rather than connection. For Chikatilo, humiliation appears to have been a foundational experience. He was, by his own account and by later psychological evaluation, plagued by a condition he could not name and did not understand. He was unable to achieve or maintain normal sexual function under ordinary circumstances. He suffered from what appears to have been a form of impotence that caused him profound shame throughout his adolescence and early adult life. In the deeply masculine, performative culture of Soviet Russia, where male identity was tightly bound to physical strength, sexual potency, and social dominance, this was not simply an inconvenience. For a boy already marked by poverty, family shame, and social isolation, it became another layer of humiliation he could not escape and could not confess. He was also, during childhood, severely nearsighted. He could barely see and was frequently mocked by other children for his clumsiness, his inability to keep up, his appearance. He was not athletic. He was not socially confident. He was small, frightened, and perhaps most importantly, deeply aware of his own inadequacy compared to the world around him. There is something important to understand here that often gets lost in true crime discussions. The experience of chronic shame, not guilt, which is about actions, but shame, which is about the self, is one of the most psychologically corrosive forces a human being can endure. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. And when shame becomes the organizing principle of a child's inner life, when it is reinforced repeatedly by failure, humiliation, rejection, and isolation, it does not simply produce sadness or low self-esteem. In certain psychological configurations, it produces rage. A deep, structurally hidden rage that the person may not even consciously experience as rage. Because to feel rage openly would require a sense of entitlement, a sense of self that chronic shame has already destroyed. The rage goes inward, and then slowly, it begins to take on a different shape. Chikatilo was, by many accounts, a diligent student. He worked hard. He studied seriously. He attempted to participate in the Komsomol, the Soviet Communist Youth League, with genuine enthusiasm, and was rejected for membership, reportedly more than once, partly because of his father's status as a former prisoner of war. This rejection was not trivial. In Soviet society, Komsomol membership was a form of social legitimacy, a gateway into the kind of respectable Soviet identity that Chikatilo desperately wanted. To be excluded was to be marked, and to be marked, again, as different, as less. He eventually managed to study and work in the field of communications engineering, and later pursued a teaching degree. He worked as a teacher at various points in his life, initially in schools in the Rostov region, and this is where the picture becomes more complex and more disturbing. Because it was during this period, during his adult life as an apparently functioning member of Soviet society, that the internal pressure that had been building for decades began to find its first external expression. He married a woman named Fayina in 1963, apparently through an arrangement facilitated by his sister. By most accounts, the marriage was functional in its social dimension. They had 2 children, but deeply troubled in its intimate one. Chikatilo's inability to achieve normal sexual function within the marriage was a source of ongoing shame and tension. Some accounts suggest that the couple managed to conceive children through methods that circumvented his impotence, but the emotional weight of his condition never disappeared. It remained. It pressed against the inside of his identity every day. And during this same period, the 1960s and into the 1970s, something else was happening. Something that no one around him could see. Chikatilo appears to have begun developing a private fantasy life in which violence and sexual gratification became psychologically linked. This is not uncommon in the documented profiles of individuals who later commit serious sexual offenses. What researchers have observed across numerous case studies is that for some individuals, particularly those with histories of profound shame, impaired sexual function, and a deep sense of powerlessness, The fantasy life begins to reorganize itself around scenarios of dominance and control. The fantasy is not primarily about pleasure in the ordinary sense. It is about the annihilation of helplessness. It is about becoming in the internal world the opposite of what one feels oneself to be in the external world. Chikatilo was a man who felt, at his core, powerless, humiliated, invisible, and the fantasy, slowly and without anyone's awareness, was becoming the only place where that powerlessness dissolved. He was also, during his years as a teacher, exhibiting behavioral patterns that should have been recognized as serious warning signs, but were not, or were minimized, or were handled in ways that allowed him to continue. There were complaints from parents and students about inappropriate behavior. In at least one case, there were formal reports of Chikatilo touching students inappropriately. He was removed from one teaching position. He moved. He found other work. He continued. This is one of the most disturbing patterns in the documented history of his life. The degree to which institutional failure, bureaucratic indifference, and the Soviet system's tendency to manage information quietly rather than address it transparently allowed a man who was exhibiting clear signs of predatory behavior to simply change locations and continue. He was never seriously investigated. He was never meaningfully confronted. He was allowed to drift from position to position, teacher, supply clerk, factory employee, each time taking his internal world with him. By the late 1970s, Chikatilo had developed a method of approaching potential victims that was, in its mechanics, devastatingly simple. He was an adult male in a position of apparent authority or normalcy. He could approach children or young women in public spaces, train stations, bus stops, the edges of wooded areas, with a quiet, unremarkable manner that did not trigger alarm. He did not look dangerous. He looked like a clerk, a teacher, a Soviet worker in a winter coat carrying a bag. The first documented murder attributed to Chikatilo occurred in December 1978. The victim was a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova. She was lured near a small house Chikatilo had access to in the Shakhty area. What happened there was an act of horrifying violence, and in its immediate aftermath, something occurred that would have profound consequences. Another man was arrested, tried, and executed for the crime. His name was Alexander Kravchenko. He was innocent. He was killed by the Soviet state for something he did not do, while the man who was actually responsible continued to live, to work, to move through ordinary life, to ride trains and attend to his family. The wrongful execution of Kravchenko is one of the most shattering elements of the entire case. Not only because it represents a catastrophic failure of justice, but because it effectively removed Chikatilo from suspicion for years. The case was considered closed. The killer, in the eyes of the Soviet investigative system, was already dead. And so Chikatilo was free. Free to become more organized. Free to learn what he had not yet understood about himself. Free to begin the escalation. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo committed what investigators eventually determined were at least 52 murders, though some estimates place the number higher. The victims were children, both boys and girls, and young women. They were runaways, individuals experiencing homelessness, young people in vulnerable situations who were moving through public transportation systems, through train stations, through the kind of Soviet social geography where people in difficulty often found themselves without reliable protection. The geography itself is important to understand. The Soviet Union of this era was not a society where information traveled freely. There was no open press investigating disappearances. There was no social media. There was no mechanism by which families in one city could connect with families in another to identify a pattern. The state controlled the flow of information, and the state for years was either unable to perceive the pattern that was forming or reluctant to acknowledge publicly that a serial killer was operating in the Soviet Union, because the existence of such a killer was ideologically inconvenient. Serial killers, according to Soviet official doctrine, were a product of capitalist social decay. They were not supposed to exist in a socialist state. This ideological blindness had real consequences. It slowed the investigation. It created institutional pressure to reach conclusions quickly, which led to wrongful arrests and, in some cases, wrongful convictions. It prioritized the appearance of resolution over the reality of continued danger. And while the investigative machinery struggled against its own limitations, Chikatilo continued. What investigators later pieced together about his methodology reveals a psychology of extraordinary compartmentalization. He was able to engage in acts of extreme violence and then return, apparently without visible disturbance, to his ordinary life. He ate dinner with his family. He appeared at work. He may have sat in apartment buildings with neighbors, discussing the news, the weather, the difficulties of Soviet daily life. And no one saw any fracture in the surface. This is one of the aspects of his psychology that researchers have found most difficult to fully account for. The ability to compartmentalize, to maintain what appears to be a stable, functioning external identity while simultaneously housing an internal world of consuming violence, suggests a degree of psychological organization that is deeply unsettling. It is not that such people feel nothing. It appears to be more complex than that. It appears that the internal world, the fantasy, the compulsion, the ritualized enactment of violence, exists in a separate psychological chamber, sealed off from the external performance of normalcy with a rigidity that defies ordinary understanding. For Chikatilo, investigators and psychological evaluators who examined him after his arrest have suggested that the crimes were not simply expressions of anger or hatred, though those elements may have been present. They appear to have been, at their psychological core, acts of compulsion, driven by a fantasy structure that had been forming for decades, that had become the only arena in which his profound sense of impotence, shame, and powerlessness was temporarily relieved. The violence was not incidental to the gratification. It was, in his psychology, the gratification. And after each act, the relief was temporary. The pressure returned. The compulsion reasserted itself. The cycle continued. This cycling pattern is documented in many serious cases of predatory violence, and it is one of the most disturbing things to contemplate, not because it explains the crimes in a way that diminishes responsibility, but because it reveals how a pattern, once established in this form, tends to intensify rather than diminish over time. The intervals between Chikatilo's crimes varied. There were periods of relative dormancy, but the pattern did not stop of its own accord. It escalated. There is something important to say about the victims. They were real human beings, children with families, young people with futures, individuals who were in many cases already living difficult lives and found themselves in the wrong place, approached by a man who appeared safe enough. Their deaths were acts of profound cruelty. Their absence left devastation in its wake. The psychological focus of this documentary should not be mistaken for indifference to them. Understanding the psychology of the perpetrator is not about sympathy for the perpetrator. It is about understanding how such things happen so that the patterns can be recognized and so that the people who might be seen as invisible, the runaways, the homeless young, the children without strong adult protection, can be seen with more care. By the mid-1980s, the investigation had expanded significantly, though it remained plagued by the same institutional pressures and limitations that had hampered it from the beginning. A task force had been assembled. Investigators were working the case with a level of dedication and personal sacrifice that deserves acknowledgement. They were operating within a system that was structurally resistant to what they were finding, and they continued nonetheless. One investigator in particular, Isa Kostoyev, played a crucial role in eventually bringing the case to its conclusion, though the path to that conclusion was neither straight nor simple. In 1984, Chikatilo was briefly detained and questioned in connection with the investigation. Investigators had identified him as someone who had been in areas where victims had disappeared. He was questioned. A blood sample was taken. And here, one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of forensic investigation occurred. Chikatilo's blood type as determined from his blood was type A. The secretions found at crime scenes had suggested a type AB killer. The types did not match. Chikatilo belonged to a rare category of individuals known as non-secretors, people whose blood type as expressed in their secretions differs from their actual blood type. This biological anomaly was not well understood by Soviet investigators at the time, and it had the effect of apparently clearing him. He was released, he was removed from the suspect pool, and the investigation continued without him in it. This is the kind of detail that makes Chikatilo's case genuinely haunting beyond the crimes themselves. Every element that should have stopped him. The behavioral complaints during his teaching career, the brief detention in 1984, the biological evidence that was misread, somehow deflected rather than held him. It is as though the architecture of chance and institutional failure had been designed to allow the maximum amount of damage to occur before the pattern was finally broken. He continued, more victims, more disappearances in the forests and fields around the Rostov region and beyond. By 1990, a new phase of surveillance had been established. Police were stationed at train stations and in areas where victims had previously been encountered. It was during one of these surveillance operations, in November 1990, that a plainclothes officer noticed Chikatilo emerging from a wooded area near Donleskos station with mud on his boots and what appeared to be blood on his cheek. He was stopped. His documents were checked. His name was noted and reported. When investigators cross-referenced his name with the database of individuals who had been previously identified in connection with the case, they found it. The 1984 detention. The man who had been briefly questioned and released because his blood type did not match. Investigators, now aware of the non-secretor anomaly, understood immediately what they were looking at. Chikatilo was placed under intensive surveillance. On November 20, 1990, he was arrested. What followed, the interrogation, the confession, the trial, entered the public record in ways that were unusual for Soviet and post-Soviet justice. Chikatilo eventually confessed to 56 murders, though not all confessions could be verified. He was subjected to extensive psychological and psychiatric evaluation. The question of his mental state became central to the legal proceedings. Was he insane in the legal sense? Was he aware of his actions? Was he capable of understanding the nature of what he had done? The evaluations produced complex and, in some ways, contradictory conclusions. Some evaluators concluded that he suffered from a severe sexual disorder and demonstrated significant psychological abnormality. Others in the official Soviet and then Russian psychiatric system ultimately determined that he was legally sane, that he had understood what he was doing and had acted with intent. The question of diagnosis, the specific clinical terminology applied to his condition, has been debated in the years since by researchers and psychologists who have studied the case, but the official legal determination was clear. He was held responsible. During the trial, which was held in a cage in the courtroom in a manner both unprecedented and deeply strange, Chikatilo behaved in ways that many observers described as theatrical and difficult to interpret. He sang. He made seemingly incoherent statements. He exposed himself. Some observers believed these behaviors were genuine expressions of psychological disintegration. Others believed they were, at least partially, performance. The same performance of behavior that a man who had maintained a mask for decades might produce when the mask was finally removed, and there was nothing underneath it to replace it. What is perhaps most chilling in retrospect is what the performance revealed. That even in a courtroom, even after confession, even surrounded by evidence of what he had done, Chikatilo appeared to have no stable, coherent sense of self beneath the surface. The public self, the quiet teacher, the Soviet worker, the unremarkable man on the train, had been a construction. And when the construction was dismantled, what emerged was not a hidden, coherent identity. It was chaos, fragmentation, a psychological architecture that had been held together by compulsion, secrecy, and the organizing force of the crimes themselves. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. He was executed on February 14, 1994, with a single gunshot to the back of the head. The world outside Russia learned his name slowly, through the gradual opening of Soviet-era records and the work of journalists and researchers who spent years piecing together what had happened. In the years since, his case has been studied extensively by criminologists, forensic psychologists, researchers interested in the intersection of developmental trauma, shame, sexual dysfunction, and violence. It has become, in many academic and forensic contexts, a reference point for understanding how a specific constellation of psychological factors can, over decades, produce something that the ordinary human mind resists accepting as possible. Because that is the final, most important thing to understand about Andrei Chikatilo. He was not born a killer. He was not a creature who arrived in the world already formed in darkness. He was a child, a frightened, poor, humiliated, isolated child in a world that was itself traumatized and brutal, who grew, decade by decade, into something that no one around him recognized until long after the damage had been done. The warning signs were there. The behavioral complaints, the social isolation, the documented incidents, the gaps in his psychological history that should have prompted questions. They were there, and they were not seen, or they were seen and not acted upon, or the systems that should have acted were too rigid, too ideologically constrained, too bureaucratically indifferent to do what needed to be done. This is not a story about a monster who appeared from nowhere. It is a story about a pattern that formed in childhood, organized itself in silence through adolescence and adulthood, found its expression in acts of devastating cruelty, and continued for more than a decade because the world around it was looking in the wrong direction, at the wrong evidence, through the wrong ideological lens, with the wrong assumptions about what danger looks like. Danger, as Andrei Chikatilo demonstrated with terrible consistency, does not announce itself. It does not look unusual. It carries a briefcase. It wears a winter coat. It boards a train, finds a seat, and looks out the window at the landscape passing by, completely indistinguishable from every other passenger on the platform. That is the most disturbing thing about his story, not the crimes themselves, horrific as they were, not the number of victims, devastating as that number is. The most disturbing thing is the ordinariness, the decades of invisible escalation, the way the pattern grew and deepened and organized itself inside a life that, from the outside, looked like nothing more than an unremarkable Soviet existence. The pattern was always there, hidden in the silence, waiting to be understood only after it was far, far too late.